I've never been the type to believe in horror stories or strange occurrences, but what happened that night left me completely speechless. My wife and I decided to spend a weekend in an isolated cabin, one of those places you find online, far from the city. Everything was perfect. The place was cozy, surrounded by trees and silence. We spent the afternoon relaxing, preparing dinner, and enjoying the peaceful nature. The night fell quickly, and we were already in bed when something woke us up. Loud knocks on the front door, almost like a punch. We opened our eyes, confused, and when we tried to listen more closely, the man spoke from outside, saying he was from the maintenance team and there was a gas leak in the cabin. He sounded urgent and serious, but something was off. The first thing that crossed my mind was the time. It was almost 2 a.m. Despite his professional tone, something felt wrong. Immediately, my wife and I exchanged looks and decided not to open the door. I called the rental manager, explaining the situation and asking if any maintenance was scheduled for that night. He of course said no, and there were no maintenance workers outside business hours. The situation was starting to feel too strange for my liking. My wife and I stayed silent, listening to the knocks on the door, and the man outside insisting that he needed to enter to check the gas leak. He said it would be dangerous to stay there without the maintenance being done. I looked out the window, trying to see something, and noticed he wasn't moving. I became even more uncomfortable when I realized there was no sound at all, except for his voice. No cars, no other sounds of nature. It was as if the man was just standing there in the dark, waiting for us to do something. Even though I knew we shouldn't open the door, I felt tense and unsafe. My wife, already visibly scared, suggested we call the police, but before we could make a decision, I approached the window again and looked outside. He was still there, standing still, staring directly at the door, as if waiting. I couldn't understand what he wanted or what he was doing there, especially since the cabin manager had assured me that no maintenance was scheduled for that time. At that moment, something about the situation made me think the best thing to do was to stay calm and try to resolve it rationally. But the man was starting to become an unsettling presence, and the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. Things got even more unsettling when I realized that he was no longer just watching the door. The man had approached the window, and I could see his eyes fixed on us. It was as if he knew we were there, as if he was watching us. I was starting to feel a knot in my stomach. My wife looked at me in fear and whispered, "He's watching us." Panic was starting to take over both of us, but we still tried to stay calm. I called the cabin manager again, and this time, he confirmed that no one from the team was in that area that night. When I told him the man was still out there, he didn't seem surprised, just repeated that nothing was scheduled and suggested I call the police. Before we could do anything, I heard a noise, something knocking on the door again, this time with more force. It was a firm knock, but not violent, as if he were testing our patience. My wife and I looked at each other, shivers running down our spines. The worst part was that he wasn't saying anything, just standing there waiting. Not knowing what to do, we decided to stay inside the cabin, locked up, until the man left. The problem was, with every passing minute, it felt like he was more determined to stay, and we were more trapped in that tension. That feeling of being watched became unbearable. I tried to think of a rational explanation, but nothing made sense. The man wasn't trying to break in aggressively, but his behavior was so unsettling that it was starting to make me panic. Suddenly, I heard a sound coming from the back of the cabin, as if something was dragging. I carefully went to the window, trying not to make a noise, and looked outside. The man was still there, but now he wasn't just watching the door. He was walking around the cabin slowly, stopping and staring directly at the windows, as if inspecting us from every angle. I started to wonder if he somehow knew we were there, or perhaps something even stranger was happening. The fact that he wouldn't leave, that he wouldn't go away, made me feel like we were being hunted. I grabbed the phone again, but the call to the police was interrupted. I couldn't understand, but the signal suddenly dropped. There was no way to get help anymore. With each passing second, fear took over me, and the worst part was that we were completely isolated. If that man was a threat, we were at his mercy. My mind was racing, thinking about all the possibilities. We decided to lock the doors and windows, but a strange feeling still lingered in the air. The man hadn't made any aggressive moves up to that point, but his persistence in staying there, watching, made us feel like we were trapped in a snare. Every minute felt like an eternity. Hours passed, and before I realized it, we were in the silence of the early morning. The man was still there, standing motionless, with no intention of leaving. I felt a chill down my spine, but my husband tried to reassure me, saying maybe it was some misunderstanding, someone lost, or even some kind of prank. But then something happened. In the absolute silence, we clearly heard the sound of a thud against the door, as if someone had punched the wood hard. We both froze. The sound was so loud that I almost felt the impact reverberating through the walls. I looked at my husband, and I saw the fear etched on his face as well. He slowly stood up, heart racing, and went to the door. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. The man was still there, standing, now closer to the door, and the most terrifying part, he was smiling, in a way that didn't seem natural. Suddenly, the sound of the punch was louder than ever. The door couldn't hold up, and with a crash, it opened violently. The man entered the cabin with an expression I'll never forget. The smile he had before disappeared, replaced by a serious, fixed expression, almost impersonal, as if he was there to complete a mission. My husband and I, without thinking twice, ran to the bedroom. I didn't know what to think or do anymore. Instinct was stronger than anything else. We closed the door behind us, and the sound of the man calling for our attention echoed through the house. He shouted, saying he needed to speak with us urgently. But the tone of his voice, almost mechanical, made no sense. We were paralyzed, unsure if he was really who he said he was or if he had some other intention. I curled up in the corner of the room, with my husband by my side, trying, but failing, to keep calm. He picked up the phone and, with a trembling voice, called the police. Silence took over us once again. The man didn't stop walking around the house, calling our names, as if he were searching for us. It felt like time had stopped, every sound from inside the cabin growing louder, closer. Fear was consuming us, and there was no way of knowing what he would do next. The only thing we could do was wait, in the terrifying silence, until the police arrived. I still remember hearing his footsteps approaching our room, before hearing the door to another room open. The sound of his footsteps faded, as if he were moving from one room to another, searching everywhere. My heart was pounding, and my breathing was so shallow I could barely hear my own thoughts. We were in absolute silence, waiting for him to appear at our bedroom door at any moment. The tension was unbearable. Every second felt like an eternity. That was when I finally heard the distant sound of a siren. Something inside me relaxed, but I still couldn't feel safe. The man was still around, but the hope that the police would soon arrive kept me going. Then, like in a never-ending nightmare, the man stopped speaking and silence returned. My husband, desperate, peeked out the bedroom window and saw the flashing lights of the police vehicles approaching. But before either of us could react, we heard the front door swing open with force. The police had arrived, but the man was no longer in the house. He had disappeared. There was no sign of him anywhere, not even footprints in the snow outside, as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The officers searched every corner of the cabin, but found nothing. No explanation for who he was or what he wanted. When we asked the person in charge of the rental, he said the cabin had been vacant for months, and that there had never been any scheduled maintenance. There were no records of any problems. The man was never found, and the police couldn't provide a reasonable explanation. We left immediately, without looking back. To this day, we don't know what happened that night, and the feeling that we're still being watched, even after all this time, has never disappeared. I never thought something like this would happen to us, but I'll try to explain what happened as clearly as possible. A group of friends, and I decided to spend the weekend in a secluded country house near a farm that belonged to a family friend of one of the guys in the group. The idea was simple: enjoy the tranquility of nature, take in the view of the dense forest, and disconnect from the routine. It seemed like the perfect place, until things started to get strange. The house was simple but charming. It had a large porch overlooking the forest, and the air outside felt fresher and cleaner than I remembered. The neighborhood was quiet, with an open field in front and a dirt road that led to the farm entrance. Everything was perfect at first, until Ihan, an older man who lived nearby and liked to hunt, started appearing more than usual. He had an odd look, like he was always watching us, and although he was polite, his presence was unsettling, but no one wanted to be rude to him, as he was a friend of the farm owner. The next morning, after a peaceful night, we went for a walk around the property, and when we returned, we noticed something strange. The tires on our car were flat. There was nothing around that indicated someone had done it on purpose, but the marks were obvious. The tires were completely torn, as if they had been sliced with a sharp blade. We couldn't understand what had happened. The place was isolated, with no movement around, so what could have caused this? We all stood in silence, looking at each other, trying to figure out what had happened. The strangest part was that there were no footprints or any other sign around the car, as if someone had approached, but in such a quiet way that they left no trace. One of us suggested it could have been some animal, but no one seemed to believe that. I myself was starting to feel uncomfortable, especially because Johan had appeared earlier that day and, for some reason, seemed to be watching us from a distance. It was like he was waiting for something. We decided to call the local mechanic who lived nearby, but he could only come the next day. So all we could do was stay in the house, waiting for help, and try not to panic. But the atmosphere, which had seemed calm at first, now felt heavy. Johan's behavior also became stranger. He began showing up at the same hours, as if he was watching us. He spoke little, only asking how we were, but always seemed to have something more behind his gaze. We had the feeling he was spying on us, and that feeling never left. On the second night, things got even more bizarre. I was in the bedroom trying to rest, but I couldn't stop thinking about what was happening. Suddenly, I heard the sound of light footsteps outside the window. I looked quickly but saw no one. I thought it might be some animal, like a deer or something similar, but the feeling of being watched persisted. In the middle of the night, we heard something else. A faint noise, as if something was knocking on the front door. I went to the window to check, but saw nothing. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. I felt that something wasn't right. The next day, when the mechanic finally arrived to help us, he seemed quite suspicious, but didn't ask many questions. He went straight to work, trying to figure out what had happened to the tires. But the strangest part was when he told me, with a worried expression, that it wasn't common for someone to damage tires so precisely, without leaving any trace. He made a few observations about the place, as if he were trying to understand what was going on, but soon rushed to finish the job and left without saying much more. This only increased my sense of discomfort. That night, while we were in the living room trying to relax and laugh to ease the tension, Johan appeared again. He simply entered through the front door without knocking and looked at us with that strange gaze, as if he were waiting for something. We all stood in silence for a moment, and then he said in a deep, low voice, "Don't worry, nothing will happen to you." At that moment, I felt a shiver down my spine. The way he said it didn't seem reassuring, but more like a warning. He stayed there for a few minutes, then turned and left without saying anything else. No one dared to ask what he meant. The next morning, the situation worsened. When we went to check the tires again, we saw that they were damaged once more. They weren't flat this time, but it seemed like someone had cut them with something sharp. At first, no one said anything, but the feeling that Johan was behind all of this seemed stronger than ever. No matter how much we tried to ignore it, his presence was always there, looming over us. We who had been so excited to enjoy the weekend, now just wanted to leave, but the strangest thing was that, somehow, something was keeping us there. It was as if we were being pulled back, as if Johan and the whole place wanted us to stay somehow. In the late afternoon, when we finally decided it was time to leave, the car wouldn't start. We tried everything, but the engine wouldn't respond. We looked at the tires again, and as we had seen, they were completely flat. We were stuck there, with no solution, until we heard the sound of heavy footsteps coming from the direction of the forest. At first, we thought it was some animal, but the sound was regular. It was then that we saw Johan, standing outside, watching us, with an expression I couldn't identify, but that caused me an inexplicable fear. He wasn't moving, he just stood there, still, as if he was waiting for us. Fear took over all of us, and what had seemed like a simple car breakdown now seemed like part of something bigger, something more terrifying. We didn't know what to do. We stayed silent, each of us trying to think of a way to get out of there. It was when someone suggested that, if Johan was trying to keep us there, the best option was to wait until he moved away, and then try to signal for a car to pass on the road. But Johan kept standing still. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just watched us. And that's how we spent a few more hours, with the flat tires, not knowing what to do, until Johan finally turned and walked away. The tension in the air was still thick, but when he finally disappeared into the forest, we decided we couldn't wait any longer. We tried starting the car again, and this time, miraculously, the engine worked. We couldn't understand how, but we managed to leave that place. The sense of relief didn't last long. When I looked in the rearview mirror as we drove, I could see Johan still standing at the edge of the road, watching us. We left, but to this day, I wonder what he wanted, what was going on at that farm. We never managed to explain it, but something inside me knew we weren't alone in that forest. My wife and I have always enjoyed peaceful trips, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Last year, we decided to rent a cabin in the countryside to spend a few days resting. The place was simple but cozy, surrounded by dense forest and a nearby lake. The landlord greeted us upon arrival, showed us the place, and left, leaving us alone to enjoy our stay. On the second day, while we were enjoying the late afternoon on the porch, a man appeared coming from the trail. He wore worn-out hiking clothes, a small backpack, and carried a friendly smile. He introduced himself as a local guide, and said he usually took tourists to see the stars at an isolated spot in the area. According to him, it was one of the most beautiful places to watch the sky, far from any light interference. The approach was strange from the start. He didn't seem aggressive, but he didn't carry any guiding materials, like maps or equipment. He just insisted that this tour would be unmissable, and that he knew the trail very well. I politely declined, saying we weren't interested. My wife also felt uncomfortable, and just smiled without saying anything. The man stayed there for a while, somewhat stationary, as if waiting for us to change our minds. After a few seconds of silence, he just nodded and said, "If you change your mind, I'll be around." Without saying anything else, he turned and disappeared down the trail. Once he had gone, my wife and I exchanged glances. Neither of us needed to say anything to know that we both felt something strange about that approach. It wasn't just his insistence, but the way he stood there, waiting, as if he knew we would accept eventually. We tried to ignore it and continue with the evening, but his presence lingered in our minds. Before going to bed, I made sure to lock the doors and windows well, something we didn't always do there since the place seemed safe. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a faint noise from outside, like footsteps on the porch. I held my breath and listened, trying to convince myself it could be an animal. But then I heard the sound of wood creaking very close to the door, as if someone was standing there. I lay still in bed for a few minutes, waiting to see if I would hear anything else. My wife was sleeping soundly beside me, so I decided not to wake her. When the silence returned, I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, and eventually fell asleep again. In the morning, when we went out to have breakfast on the porch, I noticed boot prints on the dirt in front of the door. Footprints that hadn't been there the day before. This made me uneasy, but at the same time, I didn't want to feed into paranoia. After all, we were in the middle of nature, and it could have been anyone passing by, right? Even so, the uncomfortable feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. My wife noticed that I was restless and asked what was wrong. I hesitated a bit, but eventually told her about the noises during the night and the footprints. She became visibly uncomfortable. We decided that, as a precaution, we would avoid leaving the cabin at night and stay more alert to any strange movements. The day went on normally. We took a walk around the area and enjoyed the tranquility of the place. However, every time I looked at the trail that led to the road, I couldn't stop thinking about that man and the way he approached us. Something just didn't feel right. Later, when we went to the main house to get some information about trails in the area, we mentioned the encounter with the supposed guide. The landlord, an elderly man who had been taking care of the place for years, frowned immediately. "Guides for night tours?" he repeated, looking confused. "There's no one who does that kind of tour around here." My stomach dropped instantly. We described the man's appearance, and the landlord's expression changed completely. He went silent for a few seconds, then, in a low voice, he said that a tourist had gone missing the previous month after leaving with a man who matched the description. My wife and I looked at each other, and I could see the same chill running down her spine that ran down mine. The landlord continued, saying that the police had investigated the disappearance but never found the tourist or any sign of where they could have gone. The guide disappeared after the incident, and no one saw him for a while. But now apparently he was back. I asked the landlord if he thought we should call the police, but he shook his head. "Without proof, they can't do anything, but it's better you leave before he shows up again." We returned to the cabin with the feeling of being watched. Every little noise in the forest made us jump. We tried to stay calm and act naturally, but deep down, we just wanted to pack our things and leave as soon as possible. The problem was that it was already getting dark, and the road to the city was complicated to drive at night. We decided to lock everything up and leave early in the morning. But that last night, we barely slept. Each creak of wood or gust of wind felt much worse. At the first light of morning, we were ready to leave. We checked through the window to see if the car was as we left it, and when we saw that nothing seemed wrong, we rushed inside and drove off without looking back. On the way, my wife remained silent, holding my hand tightly. Neither of us wanted to admit it out loud, but we knew that if we had accepted that invitation, we might never have returned. When we got to the city, We stopped at a gas station to refuel, and I took the chance to ask the attendant if he had ever heard of a guide offering night tours. The man looked at me seriously and asked, "Did he ask you to go?" When I nodded, he just murmured, "Then you were lucky." We never knew exactly what happened to the missing person, and honestly, we preferred not to find out. But one thing is for sure, we never accepted invitations from strangers on trips again.